Welcome to Take 5, your 5-minute inspirational message from Solid Rock Drogheda. Over the last few Take 5s, we've been talking about some of the former American presidents. We've been talking about their personal faith in Jesus Christ and how it impacted their fulfillment of that role of political responsibility. Now, one of the hardest U.S. presidents to assess in spiritual terms is Abraham Lincoln, possibly the most admired U.S. president ever because of leading that nation through the Civil War and against the transition from a society where much of it was based on slavery to leaving slavery behind. Now, the thing about Lincoln is this, he was never actually a committed member of any church, and yet he spoke often about the Almighty and about God's influence on his tasks. Several things about Lincoln that we should notice. One of them is this. He is reputed to have, when he died, there was a desk in his drawer, which when they opened it, they found it stuffed full of letters. And they were letters that he had written to his critics, that whenever people had criticized him publicly, privately, whatever, his initial reaction had been to write a letter that would respond and defend himself. And yet he had this practice of writing those letters, and then he would lock them in a drawer overnight and then look at them the next morning. And he found many times that the anger that had burned the night before was no longer there. And he realized that sending those letters or defending his reputation would not actually be the best and wisest cause of action. I think that's something we can all learn from Abraham Lincoln. He is also reputed to have said that whenever Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, I don't know if you're aware of this, but Harriet Beecher Stowe, her husband was teaching in a seminary, and she was in a communion service, and she had a vision of an African-American slave beaten, and she just felt led by that. She felt God was telling her to do something about this, and she wrote the great anti-slavery novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Abraham Lincoln recognized how that act of Christian obedience really had a pivotal effect upon the fight against slavery, because when the Civil War was raging, and obviously it was causing great cost, it was devastation, death, but it was, in the end, it had to be fought to get rid of the slavery that was in the nation. And when Harriet Beecher Stowe walked into Abraham Lincoln's office, he looked at her and he said, "So you're the little woman who started this great war." But perhaps my favorite anecdote about Abraham Lincoln is at the time he went to church. And he was in church, and everybody, it came to time for prayer, and according to the liturgy of the church that he was in, everybody kneeled for the prayer, but he remained standing. And people said to him, why did you do that? That was disrespectful. You know, why on earth would you do something like remaining standing when everyone else was kneeling in prayer? And he said this, he said, "As President of the United States, very often people stand in my presence." He said, and I felt that I was standing in the presence of one who was much greater. And so I stood out of respect for the one who holds a much greater authority than being President of the United States. And that is, of course, Jesus Christ, the Lord of Lords and the King of Kings. So praise God. We praise God for Abraham Lincoln. We praise God for what he did achieve in bringing the United States through a period when it had to leave behind an awful injustice that was at that time was built into its fabric. And that was a tremendous thing, a tremendously hard thing to lead the nation through. So we thank God for Abraham Lincoln, and we thank God that he did recognize that Jesus Christ was the ultimate authority. And if people stood for the president, then they should certainly stand for the King of Kings. Join us again tomorrow for another Take 5, your 5-minute inspirational message from Solid Rock Drogheda.